The Monterey Public Library welcomes you to I Hear You, Talking and Listening to People with Alzheimer's, presented by Alyson Kuhn. Alyson Kuhn is a freelance writer and editor with an eye and ear focused on brand building. Over the past 2 decades, she has worked with brands from Adobe to Zazzle. She is an insistent advocate for beautifully executed artifacts, including thank you notes and party favors, as well as for user experiences that provide delight in the digital realm. Alyson is a longstanding member of the exhibition committee of the San Francisco Center for the Book. She is also a former board member and co-curator of 3 exhibitions there. Alyson served for 5 years as communications director of the San Francisco chapter of the American Institute of Graphic Arts. She was honored to receive the AIGA Fellow Award in 2015. Alyson is particularly and perpetually grateful to the clients, notably paper companies, printers, and the Smithsonian National Postal Museum, who have given her the opportunity to write about subjects she loves, including envelopes. Alyson and I met in the spring of 2017 at a gratitude and note card writing program hosted by the Monterey Public Library. She brought with her a folder full of mail in progress and assorted vintage postage. Since then, Alyson has presented 4 programs for the library, the first 3 in our community room, and the most recent program, Essential Kindnesses on Paper, took place on Zoom. All of her talks were about expressing gratitude via real mail, the joyful delights of communicating via paper, and her beloved US Postal Service. Today, Alyson will speak about a different form of communication, talking and listening to people with Alzheimer's. Her new book, co-written with gerontologist Jane Mahakian, is titled I Hear You. You'll hear why she and Dr. Jane wanted to write this book and what you will find as you read and as you think about its practical wisdom. The book may be checked out from the Monterey Public Library, and library cards are free to anyone who lives in California. Also, the current issue of the Monterey County Weekly has a wonderful article written by Mary Duan based on her recent interview with Alyson. We know many of you are here because of this article, and we extend our appreciation to the Monterey County Weekly. We thank the Monterey Public Library Friends and Foundation for their incredible support in providing this program and their ongoing and dedicated commitment to funding library programs, services, and materials. Thank you to all who support the Friends and Foundation. To learn more about the Monterey Learns campaign or to become a member, please visit investinmpl.org. It is now my sincere pleasure to welcome Alyson Kuhn.
Thank you, Francesca. Can everyone hear me okay? Thank you for that thumbs up. So I want everyone to know that there will only be a dozen slides after this one, so no one should be nervous if I leave a particular slide up for a while I'm talking for what seems like several minutes. There are no pictures in the actual book, but there are some little graphics, which we'll talk about a little later. So the pictures that I've used for this slide presentation are not things that are from the book, but because it's all being recorded, you'll be able to see it whenever you want. One of the things that has been the most exciting to me about actually finally publishing this book is that the responses I've gotten from readers have been so diverse. Here you see a comment from a reader whose mother has dementia. And the words that she chooses spontaneously are so indicative of what many people feel when they're trying to listen and talk to someone with dementia. You see the word, excuse me, you see the word argumentative, you see the word agitated, and you see the word valuable. These are all big concepts when you're trying to actually communicate with somebody with dementia. I could talk about each of those 3 words, argumentative, agitated, and valuable, probably for the entire time, but I'm not going to do that. I just did want to make the point that people's reactions are diverse, but all of them touch on something that many of us feel. So what kind of book is I Hear You? As you can see from its size, okay, it's less than half an inch thick. It doesn't aim to answer everything. It's not a textbook. It's more of a primer, I would say. Our focus, as you see in the subtitle, is talking and listening to people with Alzheimer's. There are many, many books out already on the market about various aspects of dementia. But as far as we can tell, no one has really focused in the way that we have on the idea of talking and listening to people with Alzheimer's and other dementias as being central to taking care of them and improving the quality of their lives, and perhaps maintaining a richer relationship with them than you might think is possible once they're diagnosed with a brain disease. We do think that this book is optimistic and upbeat, much more so than you might anticipate. This isn't to sound sugar-coated. No one would choose, perhaps, to have dementia. You wouldn't choose for anyone to have it, but the fact remains that a great many people do develop dementia. And because today is the Friday before Mother's Day, I'd like to take this opportunity to share a statistic with everyone, which is that twice as many women develop Alzheimer's as men. So for every 3 people who develop Alzheimer's, 2 of them are women. There's an organization called the Women's Alzheimer's Movement, founded by Maria Shriver 10 years ago. The organization has one major purpose, which is to improve the lives of people living with Alzheimer's, but its tandem purpose, if you will, is to fund research that's trying to figure out why so many more women are susceptible to Alzheimer's compared to men. So here you see one little sentence that we chose from a very large book, Elderhood by Louise Aronson, who is a geriatrician at UCSF. And this sentence for us really sums up what we think is possible for improving the lives of people with dementia. It's the environment, and central to the environment is how they are spoken to and how they are listened to. At the heart of the book are 11 vignettes. 4 of them are actual real life stories written by me about things that happened with my mother. And the other 7 stories are composites of patients of Dr. Jane's over the 30 plus years that she has been focused completely on helping people with dementia and their families. So if we have time at the end, I will read one of these vignettes, but the vignettes, I don't want to get emotional here. So the vignettes really, in everyday language, they're super short, a couple of pages. They help you really understand what is perhaps counterintuitive about helping someone with Alzheimer's. So even if you didn't want to read the whole book, you could just read the 11 vignettes, which are followed by what we call practical points. And those points help you imagine how you could apply what you just read in this little vignette to a situation you might find yourself in. And I'm going to detour here for a moment and talk about how we refer to people with dementia. Because if someone has survived cancer, we all refer to those people as a cancer survivor. If you are diagnosed with schizophrenia, then you are schizophrenic. But there is no good term, in my opinion, for someone living with dementia. There is an abbreviation, PLWD, which stands for person living with dementia. That is widely used in the realm, if you will, of taking care of people with dementia. Dr. Jane and I didn't happen to want to use an abbreviation like PLWD throughout our book. Other people, when they're writing and speaking about dementia, tend to say loved one. And in many cases, the person that you're interacting with who has dementia is a loved one. It could be a parent, it could be a partner, it could in fact be an adult child. However, everyone with dementia doesn't have a loved one who is primarily responsible for their well-being. So we wanted a broader way, rather than PLWD, rather than loved one. And so we invented, if you will, a prototypical person with dementia. That person's name is Robin. So throughout the book, we talk about Robin just as shorthand. But it's not only family members who come into contact with people with dementia, of course. You could have a colleague who is developing dementia. You could have a neighbor who's developing dementia. And the more of us who are comfortable talking and listening to people with dementia, the less socially disappeared these people will be. It's very tempting to ignore dementia, and that never benefits anybody. So, what inspired me to write this book is the fact that Dr. Jane and I, from the first time we ever talked on the phone, were on the same page about trying to figure out what would be best for my mother. She was still living in her own home. This is a picture of one of my birthday parties, the last birthdays that I was living at her home with her. And when I realized that it was no longer safe for her to live at home, I actually called my mom's primary care physician, who I had a cordial phone relationship with. And I explained why I was concerned. And when I stopped for breath, he said, "Alyson, do you have somebody to talk to?" And I said, I'm talking to you. And he said, "No, I'm not your person. Let me recommend somebody." And the person he recommended was Jane Mahakian, who had gotten her start as a gerontologist, helping faculty and staff at UC San Francisco to care for their family members with dementia or other memory problems. She had since gone out on her own, opened a practice called Aging Matters, Inc. And I hit the jackpot, if you will. She and I had a phone call. She asked if I were actually ready to move my mother. I said that I was. She recommended a new-ish facility, a care community in San Francisco. And I went and looked at it. And now I'm going to detour for a second and tell a story that's not in the book about how I came to reserve an incredibly beautiful room for my mother. I think that the circumstances of the story will be helpful to many people. So I went and met with a marketing person, looked at a room on the memory wing, and the room was incredibly lovely. And so I asked the logical question, are all the rooms this nice? And Tom acknowledged that no, they weren't. And I said, is this in fact the loveliest room? Is that why you're showing me this room? And he said, no. And I said, is this room more expensive than the other rooms? And he said, no. And I said, so if it's the loveliest and it's not more expensive, why is it empty? And he looked at me and he said, because someone else's daughter in your circumstances backed out. And I said, can you say anything else? And he said, yes. The room had been reserved for a woman who fell at home, broke her leg, had to be hospitalized, then had to go to skilled nursing. And the entire time she would ask her daughter, when do I get to go home? When am I going home? When can I go home? And her daughter decided that she would move her mother home, which she did. So now you have a mom at home recovering from an injury that has impaired her mobility, that has made her more vulnerable, more at risk, because she was afraid that her mother would be angry or confused or what have you. So I seized that opportunity. I reserved that room, and my mother's life, from the day we moved her to this memory care community, her life got large and vibrant again. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit later, because I think that this goes against what many people think about moving someone into a care community, that is going to make their lives smaller and possibly sadder. That was not the case for me, and it's not the case for many people. So let's talk some more about the book. No, there aren't photos or diagrams in the book. It's not a book primarily about my mother. So obviously I'm talking about her a bit because I'm her daughter. And if she hadn't had dementia, I wouldn't have written this book because I never would have met Dr. Jane. So what we've done, trying very intentionally to make the book easy for people to read and even enticing, is we've put little snippets that are really big ideas, and we've put them in a very small space. So we have Dr. Jane says, and then we have let's consider. And 5 minutes ago, I said, oh, if you only read the vignettes and the practical points, you would get a lot out of the book. I would urge you, when you're browsing through your book, and I have some friends who have already read the book more than once, which is quite thrilling to me. I think that the let's consider and the Dr. Jane says really help you as placeholders. I think you could just read a couple of those at the end of the day and feel that you know a lot. So here is a quote from a reader who is actually on this call. I see her photo right now on my screen. She is extraordinarily comfortable with people with dementia because her own feelings are so non-judgmental, so go with the flow. She seems to have a knack for going where the person with dementia is. And this is something that is counterintuitive for many of us. It was not intuitive for me at the beginning. Fortunately, I had Dr. Jane as my brilliant tutor. And so if you look at just these couple of sentences, the idea of what is behind our feelings, what is behind what we say and how we say it. And I think that for many of us, we are so invested in being right, partly because we need to be right in our professional lives, in our family lives, to move things forward. But for someone with dementia, the big truth is that you can never be right unless you happen to agree with that person. Robin, our prototypical person with dementia, will always be right. You can't win. And caregivers who are good at taking care of people with dementia realize this. They let go of their need to be right, and they look for a way to get the outcome for any given interaction to be successful for both. So a wonderful example of that is I was visiting my mom one day, and one of the nursing assistants came over and said to me, Caroline wouldn't take her pills this morning. And I said, oh, okay, I'll try. And so I went over to my mother and I said, apparently they were really running late this morning. They were super busy. And so they didn't have time to bring you your pills. Shall I ask them to bring them for you now? And she goes, oh, of course, darling. So there was no need to say, apparently you wouldn't take your pills this morning. Why was that? It's over and done with. I just want her to have what she needs now. And I gave her the option of feeling that she had made the decision. This notion of approaching any interaction from the angle that's the likeliest to get you the outcome that you want, I think is a really valuable lesson, not only, might I add, when you're dealing with people who have dementia, but when you're dealing with anyone. You know, if you can let go of doing it your way and think about what's going to make the other person more comfortable, I think that that's pretty great. So I am of the opinion that it's not essential for someone who has been diagnosed with dementia to be told that. There are many, many sad stories in magazines, on NPR and other news outlets about people who received their diagnosis in a brutally frank way. And because dementia is considered a terminal illness, because you don't recover from it, many people feel that they are basically just left on their own to live out their lives, which I think is profoundly not only sad, but wrong. So my mother never knew that she had dementia. And in fact, I took her once to an orthopedist who had the nerve to dictate his notes from the exam into his little recorder while we were leaving the exam room. And he said, patient is an 80-year-old woman with Alzheimer's. And he kept going. And when we got out in the lobby, my mother said, did you hear that? And I said, I did. And she said, why did he say that? I don't have Alzheimer's. I'm offended. Well, he said it because I had told him prior to the appointment so that he might be sensitive to her limitations, but no, he was not. And so I just turned to her and I said, Mommy, I think he thinks all older people have Alzheimer's. It's okay, he's a jerk and we won't be going back there. And she goes, perfect. So Dr. Jane is really expert about this notion of helping people feel that there's nothing wrong with them. And I proved to be more comfortable doing that than I had thought I would be able to. So I learned a great deal from her. Everyone, of course, cannot have access to Dr. Jane, who works in Southern California. I was lucky enough to get to meet her when she was spending some of her time in the San Francisco Bay Area. And we wrote the book to try and help people who don't have easy access to her. So that's what was going. And here, the little caption on this slide where it says, many people with dementia do well with having a schedule and a routine. This was proven to me from the first day that we moved my mom. I was terribly anxious that she would not make this, it's not a transition, it's a huge change. And I was really nervous that she wouldn't take to it, if you will. So this is my mom at her memory care community on the right, looking, I think, like a pretty happy camper in her beautiful room with windows that overlooked 2 rows of backyards. And from the first morning, she had her purpose restored, if you will. When she was still living at home, she had become a person who dozed a little in the morning, maybe read a little, maybe watched TV a little, napped a little. She really didn't feel like she had anything to get up for. She wasn't aware of that, but I was painfully aware of it. And from that first morning at her memory care community, she did have a reason to get up. She was going to get up, she was going to put on an outfit, and she was going to walk down the hall to breakfast in the dining room. And her optimism and her joie de vivre rebounded almost instantly. Her dementia progressed extremely slowly. She managed to make new friends and a new life for herself. And I would say that that was a much larger life than she had in her home, which had shrunk, if you will, not physically the house, but socially. She didn't go out very much. Her flat was up 2 flights of stairs in San Francisco. She would have adamantly disagreed that the stairs had become difficult for her, but they had. She wasn't aware, perhaps. I don't think she was fibbing to me. I think she just didn't realize that her circumstances had changed. She had fallen twice. It was a minor miracle that I was able to help her up on both occasions. But if I hadn't been able to do that, then I would have been in the position of calling a neighbor or 911. And in one of these instances, my mother had just gotten out of the shower, so she was undressed. It was truly a miracle that she didn't crack her head on the tile. And it was shortly after that that I thought, wait, I've been lucky twice. The third time may not be the charm. It's really time to think about what we are going to do next. So here's an Instagram message that I received from another reader whose husband has dementia, and she is feeling fairly overwhelmed. And so needless to say, this for me is fairly thrilling, that she's finding the book helpful for her. So the answer to my question, did I ever feel panicky, overwhelmed? The answer is yes. Because the journey, if you will, or trajectory, or whatever you'd like to call it, of dementia is undoubtedly going to have twists and turns in it. No matter how great the care is that you've arranged for, there will be things that you don't anticipate. For me, those things almost always had to do with medication. Medication for people with dementia, well, for any of us actually, can be tricky, but when you're trying to medicate someone who can't necessarily advocate for him or herself, or can't problem solve, or can't correlate cause and effect, then you have a potential for fiasco. I will share one of these stories just as an example. I was working with a geriatric psychiatrist to taper down my mother's antidepressant because it really didn't seem like she needed it. She was thriving at her memory care community. And so we began tapering it down really slowly, really gradually. And finally, one day, she wasn't taking any. Okay, so I feel a little, I won't say smug, but I feel good that I have gone about this in a way that hasn't been painful for her. Until about 9:30 on Saturday night, her third day of having no antidepressant. And I get a call from her memory care community. And the nurse says to me, Caroline won't go into her room. And I said, I'm sorry, what do you mean? And she said exactly what I said. She's in her night clothes. She's standing out in the hall. Oh, do you know if she's in any kind of physical distress? No, we don't think so. She just won't go in her room. And I said, okay, could you tell her that I'm on the way? And so about 15 minutes later, I got there and I pretended that I didn't know about this. I just said, oh, I'm so glad you're still up. let's have a little visit. Do you want to go in your room? And she said, no. And I said, oh, okay. Shall we go sit in the room across the hall? Sure. So we go sit in the room across the hall and we chat for a minute. And then she looks at me and says, what is that clicking sound? My mother had hyperacute hearing. My hearing is not bad, but not as good as hers. And I said, I'm sorry, I don't hear it. What kind of sound is it? And she said, really, it's like a clicking. And I said, is it like a mechanical sound? Like, are you hearing some piece of equipment or something here? She goes, no. And I said, yeah, I don't hear it. And she looked at me and said, I think it's in my head. And I knew what she meant. It wasn't that she was imagining it. It was that it sounded like it was in her head. So I thought, okay, this is a moment for candor. And I said, you know what? One thing occurs to me. Tell me what you think. This is your third day with no antidepressant because you were doing so incredibly well that the doctor felt you didn't need it anymore. So last week you had a small amount and now you've had none. Do you think it could be from that? And she goes, well, I don't know what else it could be. And I said, okay, how about if I call on Monday morning and we'll get it back for you? Okay. So we then walked down the hall. We had a cup of tea. And then she was fine. So I do believe that the clicking was real. I really do. But I think she also really just needed to be heard and to be pampered a tiny bit. So we had some tea and then we walked down the hall and I tucked her in and I kissed her goodnight. And that was that. That was my second medication drama. I'm not going to take any more time telling about my subsequent ones, but I would urge you, if you are a person who has responsibility for someone with dementia, to make sure that the primary care physician, the neurologist, everybody involved knows what medications are on the regimen so that they can be monitored. I would say it's an incredibly tricky part of this. So here is a text I received from a friend of mine. The idea that she on her own figured out that this book was empowering to her. We have a list in the book of 10 things to empower Robin. And she realizes that this is a great list for everybody. And it is a great list for everybody. I think, again, that many of us become so invested in being right that we perhaps lose track a little bit of the importance of being kind. And in the therapeutic community, if you will, there is some controversy over the idea of telling someone with dementia something that is not true. And some people refer to this as a therapeutic fib. We don't happen to like that term. And so Dr. Jane and I came up with our own term, which is the kind of lie. And she can tell countless stories, a couple of which are in the book, about situations where you can empower someone with dementia by telling the person something that's not true. And in fact, maybe I will take 2 minutes and I will tell about one of these, which is an experience that Dr. Jane had with one of her patients who lived in a memory care community. She was elderly, but she believed that her parents were still alive. And at the end of the afternoon, every day, she went and waited by the door because she believed that her parents, who had been dead for decades, were coming to take her out for dinner. Every day this happens. She got agitated. And so the memory care community developed a strategy where a staff member would tell her she had a phone call, and another staff member would pretend to be from the hotel where her parents were staying and would say, Your parents have just called to let us know they're arriving late. They won't be able to take you to dinner tonight, but they will come and pick you up tomorrow. So the patient would hang up the phone. She would say, my blankety blank parents, they're constantly running late. Okay, this woman hasn't seen her parents in decades, but that's where she is in time. That's what she goes back to. So someone on the staff says, oh, well, you'll get to see them tomorrow. Won't that be nice? If you aren't going out to dinner tonight, would you have dinner with us in the dining room? And in fact, are you in the mood to help us set the tables? Because it hasn't been done yet. So now she has been listened to. She has gotten to vent a little bit about her parents, which feels good to her. And now she has a purpose. She's looking forward to dinner in the dining room at her community. So this is an unsolicited comment, as they all are, from a friend of mine who's not trying to take care of anyone with dementia. And he read the book exactly as I hope that people will. Again, it's not a textbook, so you don't have to read straight through. You can, and he goes back and does that after he browses. So I just want to encourage people who either already have the book and are tiptoeing around getting into it, or people who are contemplating ordering the book. It is not a scary book. It is only a practical and helpful book. And we think that it is within anybody's power, anybody who can read this book. And in fact, some people have said to me, I want to wait for the audio book. I want to wait for the audiobook. I don't want to read the book. Maybe one day we will have an audiobook. So again, we are trying to help as many people as possible. And that's our goal. When I was interviewed a week ago today by Mary Duan of the Monterey Weekly, at the end of our very long, rambling, free-form interview, she said, could you summarize 3 big takeaways from your book? And no one had asked me that specifically before. And so I said, yeah, let me do that. And so these are my big 3. I'm not going to read them specifically because you can all read, but I am going to talk about them. So the first one, of course, has to do with this idea of perhaps not sharing a diagnosis. It's important for someone to know what the diagnosis is, partly because dementia can mimic depression, and depression can mimic dementia. And a neurologist is going to be pretty quick to determine what's going on and to suggest appropriate steps. But it's not really essential, perhaps, that your Caroline know what that diagnosis is. I watched my mom be examined by 3 neurologists and by Dr. Mahakian. And my mother never knew specifically, like, oh, today you have to have an exam to see if you have dementia. That's not at all necessary. And I'm going to share what one of those neurologists said to help my mother become more comfortable with the idea of perhaps needing help. So the neurologist actually held her hands up just like this. And she said, Caroline, if you think of your independence as being right here, and independence was the word for my mother. My mother wanted to maintain her independence, thought she still was independent, even though her independence was already on the downward slide, if you will. So anyway, the neurologist holds up her hands and says, if you think of this as your independence, if you give up a little bit around the edges, you still have a lot of independence. And that amount that you give up could be having someone to help you at home, to which my mother says, I don't need any help. the neurologist continues and she says, however, if you were to fall or have another sort of accident or an emergency, you would temporarily lose almost all your independence. You would have very little, and you would never get back as much as you had had before. So perhaps rather than risking that, you want to think about being here. And I thought that was a brilliant way to put it. My brother and my sister were at that neurology appointment with me. I think that the three of us were all doing our best to maintain our composure. It was very emotional for our mother, but I think it really helped the three adult children see what was inevitable, if you will. So the second big takeaway, be vigilant. Vigilant is more than being observant. Dr. Jane has a little saying, which is, if I had a dime for every time an adult child said, oh, but she sounded great on the phone. If I had a dime for every time I've heard that, I could buy all of my patients and their families boxes of See's candy, which happens to be a currency for us of favor exchange. So you don't have to have a checklist necessarily to be vigilant, but you have to be open to seeing what you don't want to see. And Dr. Jane tells stories, some of them in the book, about the things that she encounters when she goes to people's homes. And I will just share a couple because I want to have time for questions. She goes to a home and she says that she needs to use the restroom, please, so that she can go in there and have a quick look-see. And one of the things she commonly finds is that the bathtub or shower is no longer being used for bathing. It is being used for storage area. Well, obviously, if there are boxes and furniture and trash in the tub or the shower, then the person isn't bathing. If there is no soap at the sink or the bar of soap is dry and cracked, then perhaps hand washing isn't happening. If there's no toothpaste, if she can't find a toothbrush. So these are all things that in a couple of minutes tell her what's going on. And in some instances, the bathrooms where she's finding that are not the bathrooms of people who live alone. They are people who have professional caregivers. So there are some caregivers that are great, but not all. And so you need to be vigilant, whether you're paying for help already and you're totally entitled to having updates and reports and even photos in the age of phone photos to see what's going on if in fact you can't monitor this yourself. One of my big things, if you will, one of my mantras, not only for this topic, but in general, is people see what they want to see, they hear what they want to hear. And you have to not allow yourself the luxury of doing that if you're trying to take care of someone with dementia, or even if you're trying merely to maintain a relationship, to be friendly, to not change the subject and pretend that you didn't hear what the person said. And my third takeaway is this idea of being kind. And the kind of lie. I can't emphasize this enough. The kind of lie really is the kindest thing that you can do for someone with dementia when you are listening and talking, because you are valuing that person's well-being. Why would you want to tell somebody something that only will upset them or frighten them? You can't boss someone with dementia. You can only go where they are. So that is my unpacking of the book in a sort of wandering fashion. I could tell many more stories. And what I'd like to do, since I've managed to finish before 5 o'clock, is I'd like to read one short vignette about my mom. And it is called Make New Friends. So this is going to be my case for the idea that the life of someone with dementia doesn't have to get smaller as the disease progresses. It can actually get larger and richer. So here we go. My mother, Caroline, has now been living in a memory care community for several months. Our family friend Gladys is my mother's most frequent companion. One Monday afternoon, the three of us slowly walk several blocks to have dessert. I have overestimated my mother's stamina, and she is really tired on our walk back. Then we see a sandwich board on the next corner announcing that a shop I had wanted to visit but thought was closed on Monday is in fact open. It is not out of our way at all, and my mother is game to stop in. I am hoping that she might be able to sit down for a few minutes. The proprietress, Joan O'Connor, introduces herself, and we introduce ourselves as well. I add that my mother lives just around the corner. The front of Joan's shop is at street level, but the back room is up one high step. Caroline realizes she cannot make it up the step, so she says she'll just keep browsing in the front. Joan immediately says that she has a sturdy little vintage step stool. She gets it, helps my mother up, and matter-of-factly asks Caroline if she would like to sit down. Joan offers her a chair, and Gladys and I feel like we have hit the jackpot. Joan mentions how much she likes the Thai restaurant at the corner, so Gladys, my mother, and I go for lunch one day. Over the next few months, Gladys and my mother visit Joan's shop several times. They also concoct a special dish for themselves at the Thai restaurant. Thanks to Joan, my mother feels like a regular in her new neighborhood. She feels connected rather than isolated. My mother's mobility continues to gently decline, and she tires more quickly when walking. It has become much easier to take her out in a wheelchair, and Gladys makes these outings as fun as possible. One afternoon, after a doctor's appointment, Gladys calls me to report that the wheelchair taxi, which had been arranged for, hasn't shown up to take them back to my mother's care community. They've been waiting on the sidewalk for about 15 minutes. It's getting chilly, and my mother would like to use the ladies' room, but they're both anxious about missing the taxi. Ultimately, Gladys resolves everything smoothly, but by the time they get back to Caroline's room, not only is my mother totally chilled, but she's also missed dinner. Gladys offers to stay with my mother while she takes a shower to warm up, and I try to figure out how to have a happy ending to this story. I call Joan, who is just closing up her shop for the night. I say that I'm about to ask a big favor, and I explain the situation. I ask Joan if she can call in an order to the Thai restaurant, pay for it, and then walk it around the block and deliver it to my mother's room. She doesn't hesitate for an instant, asking only if I know what items my mother and Gladys would like. I'm relieved. I'm touched. I call my mother to tell her that our friend Joan will personally deliver hot Thai food for herself and Gladys in a matter of minutes. So this allows me to make a closing point before we open it up for questions. And that is the idea that you cannot do this by yourself. It's too complex an undertaking. And unfortunately, many people are still a little bit embarrassed about admitting that their partner or parent has dementia. And this is just a huge shame, and it's unnecessary. I think the stigma is starting to lift, but it's still there. And I would urge you, if you are in these circumstances, to confide in someone who doesn't have to be a professional person that you pay, although that can certainly be helpful, because people in this world have, I won't say they've seen it all, but they've seen a great deal. And so things that are mysterious or upsetting to you may in fact be not so unusual. And so to have someone to talk to or to go to a support group, I went to a support group for a while at the care community where my mom was living. And that enabled me to learn something about her fellow residents, which helped me to engage a little more successfully with them. Whoops. What is happening here? Pardon me. There we are. So I am going to stop talking and encourage people who have questions, and perhaps you've already entered them in the chat, or perhaps you're just going to raise your chat hand, and let's see if we can talk about them together. And if I can answer them, I will. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alyson. We do have some comments, of course, and some questions as well. And just a reminder for anyone here, you can type your question in the chat box, or you can also raise your Zoom hand. If you see the symbol that says reactions, you'll be able to click that and then raise your hand. I'll also be looking out for you if you instead just want to raise your physical hand as well. Again, our sincere thank you. Thanks, Alyson. One question here is, how would you respond to your spouse who has been diagnosed with Alzheimer's? What's happening to him? In other words, what if you haven't told him that he has Alzheimer's and he keeps noticing his own losses and wonders what's happening to him? Thanks.
Ooh. So before I give my layperson answer, I want to stress that I'm not a professional. I'm not a gerontologist. My co-author is. I was very lucky with my mother that she never asked me that question. Well, actually, let me go back and say that yes, she did once. She said, I have all my marbles, don't I? And I made one baby step down that path. And the look on her face told me that I couldn't go any farther. And so I said, I think you do have all your marbles, and I think you have quite a lot of them. And so there's a lot of stuff in your head. Anyway, that's not to make light of that question. My recommendation, honestly, would be to get some guidance as to what to say from somebody who has professional experience doing that. There's a great deal to be said for having what I'm going to call a little script that makes sense to, in this case, your spouse. So my mother, who wasn't pleased at the idea of moving out of her home, needed a script for herself that made sense. And so when I explained to her that I wished that I could let her stay in her home because I knew that was what she wanted, but I couldn't do that because I felt she had become too isolated, and I felt that it was no longer physically safe for her. And so I needed to ask her to try this, meaning the memory community, and she could bring all her happy memories with her. And she could understand that. And several weeks later, she recounted to me, and I don't know if it had really happened or whether she imagined it or whether she made it up because she thought it would please me. But she said to me, you know, so-and-so down the hall here said to me, your daughter is here like all the time. And so I said to her, this is my mother talking, I said to her, we enjoy each other's company. So yes, she comes over to see me. And this woman said, well, where does she live, your daughter? And my mother said, she lives in our flat on 7th Avenue. And this woman said, well, why don't you live there with her? And my mother said, because my 3 children felt that I was too isolated there and that I wasn't physically safe there any longer. So they asked me to try living here, and they were hoping that it would be better for me. And I think they were right. So again, she had this script, whether it was mental or not, I don't know, but she had a way of understanding her circumstances. And I realized that that didn't really answer your question, but I think that if you get some help in crafting your thing, ideally from someone with whom you meet with your spouse, then you're going to have a way forward that will be less stressful for both of you. And I'm sorry I couldn't give a more specific response.
Thank you, Alyson. We'll move next to somebody who has their hand up. Jen, I noticed you had your hand up early on, so you are able to unmute yourself. And there's a chance that the hand might have been accidentally up. And in that case, we'll move to Barbara Mossberg. If you're able to unmute yourself.
Yes, I wanted to thank you tremendously, and to Mary for writing about this that enabled me to come. I'm here in Oregon. And I wanted to suggest that there's yet another audience that can benefit so much from this book. And this is for people who have already been through and experienced their loved ones in assisted living and having dementia. My mother died in 2010 with the diagnosis of dementia, having lived for 3 years in assisted living and been in and out of hospice 3 times. And just so far, just what I've learned has been so helpful for me in processing what I experienced. And I think that there are as many people that are now dealing and engaged with people who have dementia. There's even more who have already done this and have had so many questions and have been alone in this experience. And you have opened up and widened this community and given us ways to see, to forgive, and to celebrate. And I really want to thank you.
Oh, thank you for articulating that. I am going to try and not tear up since I've made it through an entire hour without getting emotional. Thank you, Barbara, so much for that. My siblings and I had major advantages, if you will, when we were trying to figure out how to take care of our mother. And my friend Jen, actually, who had her hand up earlier and has now withdrawn it, she was one of our first readers, and she said to me, the book is good. You have to add a section about why you wanted to write it. And I said, and I was so hoping to get away with not doing that. And she said, no, I can't endorse that. I think you need to try. And I wrote it. And I thought, this is not bad. This is valuable for people. And she said, no, that's not it. And I tried again. And I said, how's this? And she goes, that's not it. And on the third time, she said, okay, that's quite good. And now I'm so happy that it is in the book. And I do make the point that we had major advantages in trying to take care of her. A, because I discovered Dr. Jane so early on. My mother lived in memory care communities for just under 10 years. I believe that her dementia progressed really slowly because she was in a place where she felt safe and she had no stress. In addition to that, she had the financial resources so that we could put her in an environment that we felt was the best for her. And also she had this friend, Gladys, who made it so much more fun for her to do anything. And at the end of my little section, I said, if we hadn't had these advantages, it's highly likely that I wouldn't have written this book, and that instead I would have just tried to forget what had happened.
Mhm.
Fortunately for me, that wasn't the case. And so now I'm very hopeful that this book will help a lot of people. One of my biggest excitements so far is that a lot of people are buying the book as a gift. And I had never thought of it that way, but of course there's two meanings of the word gift. And so it's a very exciting time for me. Thank you again, Barbara.
Thank you.
Thank you. We'll move next to Leonard. If you can go ahead and unmute yourself, please.
Yes, thank you for taking the, give me the opportunity. I just have a question. It's often used, and it has been in this presentation, linking Alzheimer's and dementia, or seeing them both as the same. And my understanding is that they're not the same. And in fact, the only way to diagnose Alzheimer's is through an autopsy. And I'm wondering if you might be able to correct me if I'm wrong. Thank you for taking the question.
And thank you for asking. It's something that I should have clarified earlier. So Alzheimer's is a form of dementia. It is the most prevalent form. That is one of the 10 questions actually that Dr. Jane is asked most often in her support groups. And so it's one of the top 10 that we include in chapter 1, talking about that. So the answer is that dementia is the broader category, if you will, and Alzheimer's is the prevalent, at least at present, form of dementia. And for many years, it was true that the only way you could actually confirm a diagnosis was by autopsying someone's brain, but that now has been precluded. There are other tests that can be done, which you wouldn't do posthumously, but tests that you can do while someone is living, because increasingly, science is looking for ways to figure out who has what and who is predisposed to what. And so now, as early onset Alzheimer's is quite on the rise. I'm not going to say exponentially since I'm a baby boomer, but it is perceptibly on the rise. There is increasing attention being paid to how can you figure out in advance whether somebody is likely to develop this. And that was perhaps not a brilliant answer, but it's the best I can do.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next, Anne, please.
Yes, hi, my name's Anne. Hi, Allison. That was really fantastic. I wanted to mention, because somebody had noted in the chat, if you're not at the person's house often, how do you know that the caregivers are doing a good job? And as a caregiver, I found that having a daily quick phone call or text about how the day went was really helpful, or an email. There was one family I worked with that they weren't interested enough. And so they didn't really have a gauge on whether their mother could be left alone or not. And I would have liked to have communicated with them more. But I think there are ways that if you can meet in person with your caregiver and really get a feel for what they're like in person, I think your heart can kind of tell if somebody is able to be kind and generous. And then the other way is, like I said, to do daily check-ins, because you're not going to be able to do a daily check-in with the person with dementia and have it be correct. One time, a woman I was living with told her daughter that there were men in the house, and there were never men in the house. And, you know, that daughter had to trust me enough to trust that her mother was making up a story. So there's things like that that happen where it became a joke between me and her mother about the men in the house. But there are things that you can do to make sure that the person that you have taking care of your loved one is on the up and up and is honest. The one other thing I want to say is about being in the moment. Living with people with Alzheimer's taught me to stay in this moment with them where they are, even if in this moment they think it's 1960 and they're 20, or in this moment, if they're commenting on the beautiful flowers outside, again, for the third time, to just let go of any kind of fear that you might have about, oh my gosh, that person's losing it, or how it might look to other people, and just be with them in the moment, because that's the moment that counts, is that they feel met in the moment they're in, and then they relax. And that's what you want to do, is have them feel relaxed, and also have, you know, their dignity of being, they may be behaving kind of like a child, but they're not a child, they're an adult, and they need to have that dignity. So thank you for letting me share.
Thank you, Anne.
Thank you as well, Anne. And that was a question, as she mentioned, that was placed in the chat, how to monitor in-home caregivers when you are not around often. There was also a question if there's any helpful technology hacks that you are aware of. So I don't know if you have any comments on either of those.
I was hugely lucky because I was able to check in with my mom when she wasn't living in her own house. And that also requires vigilance. Let me talk actually about that for 1 minute. The notion of care communities, they are not all created equal by a long shot, and one size does not fit all. And Dr. Jane actually was my guide on this as well, because she has her finger on the pulse of communities. But through her, I also learned to do that a little bit. A community is really a building and the people inside it who work there. And when staff changes, then there can be big changes that ripple out. You can't keep a person in a bubble, but as Anne just said, you can have check-ins. If you live far away or for some other reason aren't able to monitor the situation personally, then I think 2 things you consider are, is there a neighbor who would be comfortable doing that with a specific mission, if you will? In other words, oh, hi, could you deliver whatever the item is to my mother? I'll tell her you're going to bring it over. And while you're there, could you ask to use the bathroom or what have you? So that you can get a first eyewitness report on the situation. And if there isn't really anybody that you can do that with, then if you've obtained your caregiver through an agency, I think what you have to do is call the agency and say, you need to have photos or something, figure out what is going to be reassuring to you. That's a tough one. And frankly, I'm really glad that I was never in that situation. As far as technology hacks go, I'm not aware of any because I never used any. So it's certainly possible that there are, monitors, the way there are monitors that people put in babies' bedrooms or something. I'm guessing that now more and more there are things like that, but I myself am not aware of them. And I'm sorry, I can't be more helpful on that one.
Thank you, Alyson. Another question is, having already helped care for 2 elderly relatives through dementia, I'm more on the side of needing care myself in the future. If you have dementia, do you have any capability to help your caregivers?
Oh, I would say yes. I would say yes, particularly if you are, I'm going to say experienced, right? So whoever's asked this question has had this experience. And I would say that you can absolutely help your caregivers by sort of being a partner in your own care and letting the caregiver, who in most instances is not someone with whom you have a rich history. And so I think that to help someone know what your history is and what your likes are, there's a chain of memory care communities that has big display cases in front of each room. So they're in the hall, they're in a public area, and that way visitors can see sort of artifacts of someone's past, whether it's photos or things that they've made or built or things that they find beautiful. So it's sort of a time capsule, if you will, of someone's life. And I would think that if you have the awareness of your circumstances, that perhaps you could write something while you still feel on top of your game, so to speak, that is going to help somebody down the road to take better care of you.
Thank you. Excellent. And if the person who asked that wants to follow up at all, you're of course welcome to do so. There are some comments coming through, no specific questions yet. So I'll just look through to see if anyone raises their hand in the gallery or, oh, I see. Let's see. Of course, you can always raise your Zoom hand. Okay, Mark and Leonard, great. I'll ask Mark to go first since you haven't spoken, and then Leonard, you'll be next.
Unmuting. I don't know how it fits into the dialogue because it is challenging, but the physical element of when my grandpa, who dealt with Alzheimer's, got a little bit physical, are there anything that you would suggest to help? I really valued the tools that you've shared, and they seem really effective. But when it comes to something more, I want to say not violent, but challenging without support, any thoughts there?
Thank you for asking. That's not something that I ever had to deal with in the sense that I think you're describing, but I will say this: frequently behavior can be misinterpreted. There's always something behind someone's seemingly physically aggressive behavior. And I will share a story. There's a vignette about this in the book. My mother was having physical therapy, and Dr. Jane called me one day and said, Caroline has hit her therapist. And I said, what? And she said, yep.
Yeah, it wasn't her character. It was not my grandpa's character. It's like.
Exactly. And so in my mother's case, Jane said, I don't think Caroline is herself. I think there's something going on here because it's so unlike her. I mean, completely unlike her. So Jane offered to take my mom to her primary care physician, who ran a blood panel. And it turned out that my mother's thyroid medication had inadvertently been discontinued. She had been in the hospital, and the list of medications that was sent back with her had accidentally left that off. And so her hypothyroidism was raging. And so that can affect your cognitive functioning. And so Dr. Jane and I concluded that at the moment that my mother struck out, albeit feebly, at her physical therapist, it was because she couldn't find the words quickly enough to say, stop it, that hurts me.
Yeah.
And
All right.
so swinging at her was my mother's way of saying, stop it, you're hurting me. So I think what you have to try and do, and it's not easy, is see, is there something in particular that provokes your grandfather's aggressiveness, and maybe there's a way to pose a question if he's still verbal.
Okay. That's powerful for everybody. Like, pose a question. Thank you for that. You've been awesome, Alyson. Thank you for all the meaningful help.
Thank you very, very much. I wish you really be of good heart. What you're doing is hard, and it's kind. So.
Thank you. Leonard, if you would like to ask a question, you're able to unmute yourself now.
Yes, my wife has a question.
Actually, I'm Helen, Leonard's wife. And my question is regarding hallucinations and delusions versus dementia. I have a sister who has Parkinson's disease. And sometimes I call her almost daily. And when I do call, you never know where she's going to be. And I've heard some stories from her. Once she said she was out driving and she was lost and she had the baby with her. And when I asked who the baby was, she said it was her son, who is now 48 years old and lives in Texas, but she was lost. And I did tell her to pull over and ask somebody, but I'm still not sure how to deal with this. And as I say, I don't know whether it's a delusion. Other times she said she's waiting for her husband to come home. And once early along, I said, well, Susan, your husband died 7 years ago. And she said, oh, that's right. Don't tell anybody. But I'm unsure how to deal with it and what it is, whether it's dementia.
His sister's in a home.
Right. She has a full-time caregiver.
Right. So dementia frequently comes along for people with Parkinson's.
Okay.
So that is not a surprise. I don't know how advanced your sister's Parkinson's is and how closely its progression is being monitored. And so I think the thing that's really hard for you, since you can't be there and are trying to engage with her long distance, is that you can't know how she is really doing at that given moment. Just as with non-Parkinson's dementia, though, it's quite common for someone to be in the past at some indeterminate point in the past. And so for them at that moment, their sense of the present is wherever they are in the past. And so I think you were lucky that your sister wasn't anxious when you said that, in fact, her husband had passed away. That may come up again and again. And you will, I think, have to sort of wing it as to whether you want to go along with her perception of the reality and say, oh, has he gone out on errands? And then it's possible that her attention will shift and she'll tell you about something else. There's a wonderful blog by a photographer named Philip Toledano, who then converted part of the blog into a book called Days with My Father, and his mother had been taking care of his father, who had dementia. And then his mother developed some physical ailment and quite quickly died. And so Philip, the grown son, had no sense of how advanced his father's dementia was. And so now, how is he going to deal with telling his father that his wife has passed away. And so he decides that he will invent an alternate story for her. And he says that she has gone to visit her brother in Paris. And that way the father's totally calm. And Philip maintains that fiction forever because his father's sense of the passage of time is so impaired. And he just decided at the get-go that he couldn't deal with his father's grief, which of course his father had no way to process. He would just be sad over and over and over because it would be new news every time he heard it. So that was his decision, was to make a fiction and stick with it. So I'm sorry that I don't have a pat answer, but I would urge you, if it's possible for you, to get in touch with your sister's, key physician and share with him or her what's happening and ask if, you might consider a medication or not. I think the advice of an enlightened professional could lessen your burden and make it easier for you to not be anxious about staying in touch with your sister.
Unfortunately, at this point, they only are having a nurse come in twice a week, and they're saying that she's on hospice care and she's not seeing a physician. I have done FaceTime with her when her son is there. And most recently, it was on Easter Sunday that we had the FaceTime, and he'll send pictures of her. And her caregiver seems to be taking very good care of her. She fixes her hair and paints her nails. And so she does have a good caregiver. But each time you call, you don't know what the story is going to be.
Right. My recommendation, I think, is to go along with her reality, because it's confusing for her why you would disagree. Her reality is her reality. And I think that going there is going to be more comforting to her.
Well, except when it's sad that, like she said, that she had a lot of paperwork to do because our mother had died. And of course, our mother died 30 years ago, but she's still taking care of the paperwork. And so she couldn't talk long because she was doing paperwork. So, and as I said, with her being lost with the baby. And so a lot of her stories are, when you talk about anxiety, so it's confusing to me.
And it may be, again, I'm not a professional, just an adult daughter, but it's possible that for your sister, it's very important to feel busy.
Yes, she was a nurse. She's a retired nurse, and she was a very good nurse. So she's always been there for everybody in the family. So anyway, thank you very much for your suggestions.
You are welcome.
Thank you, Helen. And thank you, Larry. And thank you so much, Alyson. I just want to recognize that it is 5:30. We'll be staying on a little bit after if there are some more questions, and I have some comments to share as well, but we do want to say thank you to everyone who has joined this afternoon. The recording will be sent to you. We also want to, of course, give a big thanks to Alyson and to the Monterey Public Library Friends and Foundation for sponsoring this program. So please, if you do need to go, don't feel bad. Otherwise, feel free to stay on, and we'll have Susan here who has a question. I thought, oh, maybe she was just clapping and not actually raising her hand. Let's see, are there any other questions? Susan, yes, I see. Here you are. Okay.
I was trying to clap and raise my hand and everything like that. I just got flustered.
That's advanced clapping and raising your hand simultaneously.
I'm a high school teacher. I can chew gum and pat my head at the same time.
Excellent.
Thank you. This has been super helpful for me. I am the adult daughter of a wonderful woman who has not been diagnosed yet. And part of my question is about whether that's even important. I mean, we've all sort of established that her short-term memory is shot. But she doesn't really go to other times so much as she doesn't know what day it is and all that other kind of thing. But the hardest part for me, and I think the most important thing that you said today, was let go of the need to be right and just meet them where they are. Because I notice that everything is as if she were 5, that, she's very much in the moment. If she's in pain, she's in so much pain and nothing else matters. And I'm just trying to work out how to not necessarily feel like I need to solve everything for her, but just make her feel heard.
Right. Feeling heard is really important. And if her short-term memory is super impaired, then it's possible that also her ability to problem solve for herself is impaired. And so, for example, I was visiting my mother and she was shivering, like perceptibly shivering. And so I said in a matter-of-fact tone, it's a little chilly in here, don't you think? Would you like to put on a sweater? And she goes, oh, what a great idea. Because she couldn't correlate the fact that she was shivering with the fact that she was cold.
I see.
And so that's where sort of being an advocate without talking down can be really helpful. So if your mom is in pain, even if you ask her a question like, do you think that this or that would help? I mean, I had arranged for my mom to have some dental work because I couldn't avoid it. And I was over there the next day and she said, I feel like somebody has punched me in the face. And I said, I think that probably you are feeling the after effects of your dental appointment yesterday. The dentist said you did super well and that you won't need any more work. But what could we do right now? Do you like the idea of a hot wash rag? I could get you a hot wash rag. Would you like to drink some hot tea? Do you want to gargle? That sort of stuff, just acknowledging the discomfort. And sometimes, frankly, that's all that is needed, is some attention.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Alyson. It's been really, really helpful. I appreciate it. I'm gonna go get that book.
Well, thank you, Susan. I hope you will find it hugely helpful.
I'm hoping to find someone who can help me through this in the gerontologist. I have a GP for her, but I'm thinking now that maybe I do really need someone who's more specialized, who knows what's happening.
I think that a gerontologist could be great. There also are life care managers who are not necessarily doctors of any sort, but I think a gerontologist, if you can find one, is a great way to go.
Well, if anyone in the Monterey area knows one, if you could put it in the chat, that'd be super helpful. Thank you so much, Alyson. I appreciate it.
You are very welcome, Susan.
Thank you, Susan. I see that Mary has her hand up. You're welcome to unmute, or Mary Alice.
Hi, that's okay. That's okay. I just was thinking as you were talking, Alyson, your responses to your mom were just so wonderful. But I feel like that's maybe you just always had that skill. But I was thinking that it might be something that you could practice with someone else, because my mom had Alzheimer's for 12 years. And there were just so many times when it was like, she thought she had had dinner or didn't have dinner. And my immediate reaction was, you've already had dinner. And so I think it is a learning process of being able to just be able to react in the way that you've given, the examples that you've given. I almost feel like it takes practice with maybe a friend or a partner or something to react to that. Just a thought.
I think that having somebody to practice with is a great idea. So after the vignettes in the book, we have practical points where we sort of summarize what the action was and what you can learn from that and how you can implement that as well. I proved more comfortable and more adept, I think, at interacting successfully with my mother than I might have if I hadn't had Dr. Jane as my guide. And our huge hope is that the content that we've put in the book will really help people who don't have access to her or someone like her. But that notion of, there's a thing for doctors, do no harm. And I think that for all of us trying to interact with someone who's vulnerable mentally, if you will, and emotionally, that idea of doing no emotional harm. And again, most of us are so invested in being right that we tend to be quick to contradict.
Yeah.
And in fact, it just isn't helpful. Dr. Jane actually tells the story in the very introduction to the book where she's in Las Vegas for a girls' weekend with her grandmother who has some major forgetfulness. And her grandmother is playing a slot machine and finally is running low on money and says to Jane, let's go have lunch and then go by the ATM. I want to get some more money and then come back and play this machine. So they come back and Jane's grandmother stops at a machine and Jane says, actually, that's not your machine. Your machine's over there. And her grandmother says, no, it's not. This is my machine. And Jane says, no, actually, your machine's over there. And so her grandmother says, no, this is my machine. And Jane thinks, okay, so what does it matter? Well, 15 minutes later, her grandmother wins the jackpot. This is back in the days when, money is now coming out, just cascading out of the thing in this machine. And her grandmother turns to Jane and triumphantly says, honey, I know you are going to school to work with older people, but the thing you need to know is that we are always right. And so Jane says in the book, and so I too hit the jackpot that day because that notion has formed the center of my gerontology practice for over 30 years now, because it's true. So there we are. I think that practicing is a great idea. I, in a certain sense, had Jane as my coach, and so I didn't practice with anybody. But most of the time, actually, let me say one more thing, even though I know it's getting late. And that is, if you try at 2:00 and you don't succeed, there is nothing to say that you can't try at 2:05 from a different angle. And I tell a story in the book about going to pick my mom up for her 80th birthday party, a party that she was so excited about. And when I get there, she's dressed up and looking lovely. And I say, okay, let's go. And she looks at me and says, where are we going? And I remind her. And she says to me, oh, I don't really feel like it. I'd much rather just stay here. Well, that, of course, is not an option, but I can't say that. So I say, oh, okay. Why don't I go next door and see what Jack is doing? Jack was her neighbor. So I go next door, and Jack, in fact, has been invited to the party. He has forgotten, and he doesn't feel like it either. He says he's a little tired and he'd rather take a nap. So I say, okay, that's great. Caroline will be a little disappointed. We'll see you later. We're having fabulous cookies for dessert at the restaurant. Would you like us to bring you some? He says that would be quite nice. Great. So now I go back, and I truly have only been gone 5 minutes. And I say to my mother, Jack is feeling a little tired. So he says he's not going to come with us to the party. He apologizes, but would love it if we would bring him some cookies. She goes, okay. So I say, it's warm out now, but I'm sure it's going to be chilly by the time we leave the restaurant. Would you like to bring your corduroy coat with you? And she goes, oh, that's a great idea. She stands up, she freshens her lipstick, she gets her coat, and off we go. Because I have tried jiggling the party switch from a different angle. And because the person that you are trying to help probably doesn't remember, I've never heard of someone with dementia saying, I can't believe you just asked me that 3 times in a row. That doesn't happen. It's hard for those of us whose short-term memories are hyper intact to understand this, but that really is the reality, and it can work in your favor. Done. Stopping for breath.
Nice. Thank you.
Thank you. Joan, you can unmute yourself.
Thanks. I just want to say, Alyson, I'm one of the guilty ones that I bought your book, but I haven't read it. But I do, I just have a hard time settling into anything right these days. But what I do want to say, I've been really struck by the Q&A here, and as well as by your comments. And I was thinking that I hope whatever opportunities you can get to have this kind of a conversation with people is so vital, because so many of us, especially going through this right now, in my case, I'm the wife of someone with it, we don't make time to read, and we don't make time to practice and think about these points that you're expressing so beautifully. But we will, maybe more, if we have a chance to see you give an example as you did this afternoon. So I hope that you and anybody who knows other libraries or bookstores, or in the age of Zoom, surely there are lots of venues that people could benefit. And I hope that you'll let Maria Shriver know about your book. And in fact, I get a newsletter from her. I'm going to write her an email this weekend and say, hey, don't miss out on this woman, because I think you're doing something of unbelievable service that's not been done by other people. And particularly, I'm very struck by the idea that this kind of incredibly sensitive communication and skillful awareness of putting yourself in someone else's shoes, in being truly present to someone else, being kind. I mean, these are aspirations for, I think, a lot of people, and even more so coming out of COVID, as we look at what life really is about. And I think that your book comes at a really critical time of people, just trying to sort out how to move forward with the people they love, especially. And the last point I wanted to make was, somebody in the comments talked about how difficult COVID has been, especially for people in facilities and in care communities, as family visits have been so limited, and trying to communicate with somebody on an iPad who has advanced dementia is beyond the beyond. So for you, Ally, I think you're absolutely on the cusp of such an important next step. And that is how to communicate with someone going through this, and how to communicate for yourself as you're going through this. So I hope you will maximize the opportunities for you to reach lots of people. Just amazing work you've done.
Thank you so much. Our highest hope really is that by helping a lot of people feel more comfortable talking and listening to someone with dementia, that by extension, that will improve the lives of people living with dementia, because they will have more social interactions.
Mm-hmm.
And that desire to feel connected doesn't evaporate. It really doesn't, even as people become decreasingly verbal. Dr. Jane and I both believe that is inside of us as people, wanting to feel connected on some level. And so hopefully the book will help people do that. And I couldn't agree with you more that this is a phenomenally fragile time, not only for the people with dementia, but for those of us trying to take care of them.
Thank you for sharing, Joan. That was actually a comment as well. Thanks so very much for this event. It happened at the perfect time. We'll just look to see if there are any other hands that are up. There are still some, of course, comments and some accolades in the chat box, but I want to see if there's anybody that would like to. You can either raise your hand physically and I'll see you if you have your camera on, or if you want to raise your Zoom hand. If you're on the phone, you would dial *6 to raise your hand.
Francesca, I have to leave like other people have. I want to thank you so much for a beautiful hosting job. And of course to Alyson for just everything. So thanks very much. I live in San Francisco, so I've not been to your library, but I wish you well. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining.
Bye.
And your comments. Another comment from Mary Duane, not a question, but a comment. Was one of the best conversations I've had in my career, and I wish I had that book when my mother-in-law was diagnosed. Mary is a writer for The Weekly, and you can find that article in the current issue, either online or in person if you live in Monterey County. Margot commented, Alyson, what a completely helpful and generous book. Thank you so much. Joan, very important to reach out to professionals as well as people in your village for resources that will help you navigate the journey. I Hear You is one of the first books I am aware of that provides the support that families need. Beautiful book. And Jen said, thank you so much. This was incredibly informative. I learned so much from your book.
Thank you, everybody who listened. Thank you to everybody who commented. I'm so excited to have this book out in the world, where I hope it will help many, many people. And maybe to close, Francesca, maybe I'll just read the last paragraph of the book.
Please.
How does that seem? So we talk about the downward progression, if you will, for many people in their dementia. And we talk about the kind of lie. And then we say, it is important for you not to feel that you have failed in your objective. Even though you will not beat Robin's dementia, you can enrich her moment living life and still find new ways to connect with her. For Robin, as for all of us, feeling acknowledged and valued, rather than feeling ignored or alone, can make a world of difference.
Thank you so much, Alyson. Beautifully, beautifully written, beautifully shared. I kind of sense we all want to stay in this bubble of care that you've created and brought out into the world. And hopefully we'll find ways to still connect, and you'll carry these conversations forward. Obviously, it's really needed, as people have shared. And thank you for listening to that nudge to bring this book forward. And thank you, of course, to everyone who joined. It was great to have you here, and we will hope to see you at another library program. I will allow you all to unmute yourselves if on your way you want to say a thank you to Alyson or a goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alyson. That was so incredible.
Thank you very, very much.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Alyson.
everybody. You rule.
You.
Together we go further, and we can be more sensitive and supportive.
Well,
Yeah,
we
it's so
created
true.
a community with this book, and Mary has amplified this. Francesca, the library, God bless you, has amplified it. This is community.
Great job, Alyson.
It's true.
Alyson, thank you for doing your usual fine work.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Alyson.
Thank you. Thank you, truly. This isn't the easiest of topics to talk about. It's not the easiest of topics to think about, but it is so incredibly important. And I truly believe that it will be all around us.
Mhm.
So proud of you.
Thank you.